Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. My name is Drew Benson. I'm the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a formally trained macroeconomist and a certified financial planner. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. If you can believe it, it's been 4 years since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And back in the early days, the government did something that they had never done before. They locked down our economy and isolated us to our homes. Now, there were a few lone voices out there that spoke out against what they felt would be serious unintended consequences of government lockdowns. Now, these men have been vindicated because research has now emerged indicating that more people died from the lockdown measures than from the actual virus itself. Today, you're going to hear from a couple of these lone voices that were willing to speak for the truth in the face of being slandered. Today, I interview Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Don Boudreaux. Now, Jay holds an MD and a PhD in economics, and he's a professor at Stanford. Now, early in the pandemic, he co-authored what was known as the Great Barrington Declaration that cautioned against government lockdowns, which caused serious backlash from Francis Collins, who called him, quote, a fringe epidemiologist. You're also going to hear from Don Boudreaux. Don holds a PhD in economics and a JD, and he wrote prolifically about the unintended consequences of government lockdowns. He co-wrote a piece, by the way, with Jay, which is why the two of them are on here together in the Wall Street Journal, and that was titled Eradication of COVID is a Dangerous and Expensive Fantasy. Today's conversation was incredibly enlightening, and I think you're going to enjoy. Don and Jay, welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. It's an absolute honor to have you two.
Good to be here.
So let's go back to the very beginning of the pandemic. We were just talking before we hit play about the early days when the pandemic started. And Jay, I was mentioning that I read your article that you published in the Wall Street Journal back in March of 2020, and I actually had posted it on Facebook and received nothing but vitriol. So, and Don, when I had you on a couple months ago, we talked about sort of what your preliminary thoughts were in the early days of COVID, and I think we put out a nice little short of you saying this is total madness. And so, Jay, I'll start with you. At the very beginning, when COVID was surging back at the very beginning of 2020, what were you thinking personally about the government response, and then what led to that article back in March of 2020 in the Wall Street Journal?
So I was first became aware of COVID sometime in January 2020, and I was looking at the Chinese response, and it struck me as that they were trying to do a replay of SARS-1, but at scale. Like they shut down all of Hubei province, and I thought, okay, that's remarkable. I mean, that's how I don't see how that if it is SARS-1. It seems like overkill to me, and certainly draconian. They were shutting people in their apartment buildings, locking the doors, but I was like, okay, they can't. I mean, this is just as crazy, but it's a Chinese authoritarian thing. It won't happen here. Much of the political environment was there was people. I guess Trump wanted to shut down travel from China. And then the Democrats said no. I mean, it actually seemed like normal politics. I didn't think much of it.
Sure.
I didn't know how deadly disease was. I mean, that's normal in the early days of the pandemic. And I thought but then when I saw the disease that had broken out in Iran, in Italy, I thought, okay, this is going to sweep the globe. Like this isn't SARS-1. There's no way to really stop it. It's very likely much more widespread than we realize. And that's what led to that. And then when we locked down, I was absolutely floored. I mean, I couldn't believe that there weren't other economists speaking up saying, gosh, there's going to be a lot of cost to this. Like, this is really damaging. And then epidemiologists seemed to be ignoring the basic fact, which is that this disease seemed to be spread everywhere. Like, how did they think that we were going to stop it from going everywhere? And we didn't know how many people had it already. So that's what led to the op-ed. The op-ed said, we don't know how many people have had it, so we don't know how deadly it is. And the subtext is, if we don't really know how many, if a lot of people have had it, we don't even realize, we don't have a mechanism to stop it with, and a lockdown certainly isn't going to do the trick.
So I mean, I remember reading your article because in the very early days, I was a little confused. I'm like, what do we do next? I'd never encountered anything like this in my life. I'm 39 now, so I would have been say 35, and I just remember all over the news was Neil Ferguson's out of the Imperial College. I think they were saying like 3.6% or somewhere between 2 to 4%, and I have a little bit of a background in data, and so I just remember thinking there's something wrong with the way in which they're measuring this. It was like a gut instinct. And then when I came across your article, I was like, okay, this makes a lot more sense the way you studied it. So talk to us about how did you measure, because your determination of what you thought the death rate was going to be was significantly lower than what Neil Ferguson was stating. What was the difference between how you measured death rates essentially and how Neil was measuring them?
Okay, so the key concept is a distinction, something called the case fatality rate and the infection fatality rate. The case fatality rate, it just has to do with the denominator. How many people have you identified with the disease? And, in the early days of the pandemic, there's not good testing really at scale. Mainly, they're just testing people that are coming into the hospital. In China, you had to have a chest CT show positive for ground glass to like even be a positive case. It wasn't just a simple PCR test. So, but that meant that it was a selection bias problem, right? You were picking people for measuring as tests that were already severely ill. They're already in the hospital or whatnot. And so the World Health Organization, when they reported like 3.4% mortality rate, they were saying that was a case fatality rate. And so we had this major selection bias problem, this under
Yeah,
ascertainment
huge.
problem. And so the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, really it was aimed at the CDC. It was like, look, CDC, why have you not run a major survey of antibodies in the population? If you know the prevalence of antibodies in the population, if you have an antibody that's specific to COVID, that means you've had COVID. I mean, at the very least, forget about immunity, it has to do with like whether you'd had it. So just count how many people had it by doing a survey. That's really what we were proposing, and that's in fact we ended up, me and some of my colleagues, we ended up doing early in April of 2020.
And what were people's reactions to your article?
Oh, I mean, it was crazy. I got the article itself led to two of my I guess former friends, faculty friends, defriending me on Facebook, which is that
Oh
was
my
the first
word.
sign of craziness. But then I started getting death threats, accusations of like that I'd done something really really transgressive by somehow questioning whether the death rate estimates that were being put out were right. And it became really clear to me that somehow that it had become a virtue to alarm people, right? The idea, I guess, was that if people aren't alarmed, they won't comply with the lockdowns. You remember there was this man, this NBA player, Rudy Gobert, who was a 20 something, very fit NBA player. He got COVID, and then he did this press conference where he like licked the microphone,
Oh, I
and
remember that.
I mean, and he had to do this sort of Chinese style struggle session, apologizing for his wrongthink. I mean, it became really clear to me firsthand that if you didn't panic the population, you were seen as irresponsible. When all I really was trying to do was like try to understand how deadly disease actually was, how widespread it already was. Could lockdowns work? I mean, did they have any chance of work? I mean, because if it was already widespread, they already had no chance of working.
And Don, take us back. What were you thinking in the early days? And did you know Jay at the very beginning of the pandemic, or did you become friends throughout the process?
I knew of Jay's name, and I was thinking about it this morning. I can't identify just how I knew his name, but I knew of Jay's name because he's an economist. But no, we didn't know each other. We met each other only afterward. And my early thoughts were, I mean, I'm an economist, not I have no training in medical sciences at
The
all.
dismal science.
Uh, yeah, that's what some people. I think it's a great science when it's done
I
well.
do too.
Very
I love
often
it too.
not done well. By the way, it got that name because early economists were opposed to slavery. Thomas Carlyle gave it that name. Thomas Carlyle favored the old way, and so he was upset that
Wow.
economists opposed slavery. So he called it the dismal science. So
I had no idea.
yes, given that dismal science is a label for a discipline whose early proponents were universally in favor of emancipating slaves, I'm proud, and so is Jay, I'm sure, proud dismal scientist. I remember
Likewise.
So, like everyone else, I heard these and read these stories coming out of China about this horribly deadly disease, and I don't ever recall being super panicked. I never recall thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to die. I better lock myself in." But paying attention to it, and then, and you guys might remember this too. There was this photograph that presumably was a photograph of a street scene in Wuhan, and there are people laying on the ground with shopping bags in their hands. They're lying dead, and they have people with hazmat suits standing over them. And this is early 2020, February, March 2020. I remember thinking, "Whoa, this is a really bad disease. One moment you're shopping happily, the next minute you're in the street, you're dead. You had no idea what hit you." And if and so this, you remember? You recall seeing this picture?
Yeah, I remember
And
that.
so
I do.
if people believe that's true, well, of course, it's going to be very frightening. You feel fine literally 1 second, the next moment you're dead. And when you present to the public an image of a disease so insidious and so rapidly murderous, you can generate a lot of fear. Uh,
Hmm.
it, I remember having that image in my mind, and then, and I don't know the exact timing, but it was only a matter of weeks when it became clear to me from what I was reading and seeing, just observing, that however serious this disease was, it doesn't kill you instantaneously. It's not like a sniper that shoots you down as you exit the shopping market. And my and I can't say why, but my suspicion of the official narrative of COVID and the praise of lockdowns came very early. I remember where I was when I heard that Virginia was locking down. I was out. It was early March of 2020. I was out for a walk, just getting some exercise, and a friend called me on the phone. She said, "Did you hear that Virginia's locking down? Governor Northam is shutting it." And I remember thinking it was crazy, and just being depressed and the
Hmm.
economist in me immediately, of course, said this cannot. This is going to have
Can't be real.
enormous unseen consequences.
Hmm.
And just one more thing about this. This is I think one reason that I was initially suspicious, as I'm sure this played into Jay's initial suspicions too, is when you're trained as an economist, uh, you are it becomes part of you to understand the enormous extent of unintended, unseen consequences.
Hmm.
The world is a
Yep.
lot more complex than it
Yep.
appears to the naked eye.
Hmm. Hmm.
And all these scientists and politicians uh, demanding that we follow their commands just immediately struck me as these people think the world is far more simple than it really is. And my thoughts here weren't so much what Jay's were. Jay's were more about the likelihood that the virus is already so widespread that the foolishness of locking people down, it's not going to work. My thoughts were, I didn't know anything about that at the time. My thoughts at the time were, unless this disease really is one that kills people, as that photograph out of Wuhan, obviously doctored and fake,
Hmm.
suggests, these lockdowns can't possibly be worth the cost they're going to impose. Both the direct cost in terms of reduced economic activity, particularly costs that fall disproportionately heavily on poor people, but also the precedent that they set. Right? Well, if we lock down now,
I
well, we've
know.
done it once. What happens when COVID-27 shows up?
I know. It's a
Yeah.
terrifying thought,
Don,
isn't it?
I had that same exact thought as an economist. I don't know if you felt this, but I wear two hats, right? I have a medical degree and an econ degree. I intentionally left the economics out of that Wall Street Journal piece because I could tell that putting on that economist hat or what their trade-offs would lead to getting me canceled. I didn't expect having my epidemiology hat would lead to me getting
Interesting.
canceled. Um, And the idea that, that the world is so complicated, we're interconnected in deep ways. Both it meant that there was going to be tremendous unintended harm, harms from lockdowns that are really difficult to foresee, especially the poorest of the world. That was very
Correct.
clear. But also that the lockdowns couldn't work. Right because the world is complicated, there are these interactions with each other in complicated ways that are impossible to really control from some central authority. I mean, there's going to be people that need to work to feed their families. There's going to be people that need social interaction. They have to go take care of their parents. There's no way to really lock people away from each other for an extended period of time without doing tremendous damage. And actually, it's just not possible at all. Like, we're going to need to be in community with each other to some extent
Yeah.
at some point very soon. That was clear. And there was a Reuters reporter that did a story in early April 2020 where he was talking to me about the children that basically got most of their calories and meals through schools. So you close the schools, all of a sudden kids are starving in rich countries. Domestic abuse goes up, child abuse goes up, even though because schools are where you pick up child abuse. Where you so these kinds of things you don't think about unless you're a social scientist. But then, Don, as a social scientist, I mean, other than very few social scientists, we didn't speak up.
No, no, it's appalling. It's disgraceful, actually. The number of people who should have spoken up, who didn't, and to this day, it baffles me, to make an understatement. It baffles me why, and what also baffles me is the bizarre, the bad memories that people have. I had a conversation not long ago with someone who will remain nameless, who was saying, well, yes, looking back on it now, this is late 2023, looking back on it, yeah, we should have really spoken up. But at the time, we didn't know. At the time, we didn't know that COVID was really a danger mostly to old people. I said, what do you mean we didn't know?
We did know
It was
from the very beginning.
New York Times in March of 2020 pointing out the extreme variants, biased up, pointing out that the older you are, the more greater danger you are to suffer COVID. Children and young people, wasn't a significant danger at all. And the number of people today who want to excuse the silence by saying, "Well, we didn't know. We better take care. But an ounce of precaution is worth a pound of cure." And first of all, this wasn't an ounce of precaution. This was tons of precaution to get a couple of ounces of cure. So it was completely out of proportion. I remain mostly confused, baffled, and angry if I think about it too much at the silence that many of our econ colleagues who should have known better apparently didn't. David Henderson at Hoover, who Jay spoke out early.
He was my professor in graduate school.
He was.
He was my he was my not monetary theory. He was macroeconomics seminar professor at San Jose State, and a remarkable human being and a great man.
Yeah. So David, David had an essay early on in April, speaking out against the lockdown. It was published by AIER, and they had a handful of people, Jay, but very few.
So few. So you both said.
I kept waiting for it. I was confident. I'd wake up in the morning. I was confident. I would go to various blogs or see emails of people who I respect saying, this is all right. This is too much. This is, late March of 2020. We've had enough. We can't have this anymore. And it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. In fact, lots of people who should have known better actually supported the lockdowns. And then when the Great Barrington Declaration came out in October of 2020, I thought, okay, well,
finally,
here's a document that has impeccable credentials. And then by this time, and if I knew it, anybody of who's reasonably informed should have known it. By this time, we know that basically what and Jay, you can correct me on this, but I think the Great Barrington Declaration did little more than advocate what the public health authorities believed to be the best practices prior to the advent of COVID. And if you look
John,
back,
it's the least original thing I've ever worked on.
right, but the most controversial,
Yeah.
amazingly. And so, by this time, so it's clear this is just a summary statement of best practices as understood by the public health community for a long time. And by this time, I knew that the WHO had published a document in October of 2019. That basically is a long form statement of what the Great Barrington Declaration is a short form statement of. And so I was convinced, okay, this is going to be a major change. People are going to regain their senses. Well, of course, it only caused them to lose their senses further. Jay got. I'm not here to. Jay can defend himself, but Jay got pilloried. So did Martin Kulldorff.
Yeah.
So did Sunetra Gupta. So did AIAR and the people who sponsored the Great Barrington Declaration. Anyone who supported the Great Barrington Declaration was accused of being anti-science.
Mm-hmm.
And that shocked me even further. I mean, unbelievable.
I'll share a quick story. So I was an elder at a church, and I'm a Christian, and we were debating how do we handle worship on Sundays. Now we're talking way into the pandemic here. We're like well into 2021 at this point. We're the summer of 2021, and we're meeting outdoors still, and we finally get back indoors, and we're trying to have a dialogue. And there were a couple of us elders that were very much in favor of, freedom of conscience. Like if you want to come and worship, you can come and worship. And then there were others that very vehemently were against allowing people to come in without masks. There were talks of, and I'm sure as an epidemiologist, Jay, you'll find this, wild, but talks of, we were turning off the heat in the church, opening windows. It was like stay kneeling so that when you speak, the air that comes out of your mouth hits the back of the pew. And in one of the meetings, I just kept appealing to basic decency and freedom of conscience and freedom to worship on the Sabbath. And when I brought up the Great Barrington Declaration, I was immediately met with those people have been totally discredited. And it was into the dialogue. The dialogue had ceased. I'm not even in that church denomination anymore, and I ended up stepping down as an elder. And this was one of the reasons, by the way. It became so toxic. I couldn't figure out a way to reasonably work with people in that dynamic. But, another thing I was thinking about, and I'm curious on how you feel about this. I guess as a Christian, we're created in God's image. We're relational, right? So there's something about humanity that puts a huge premium on relationships with other human beings. I would say from a religious or philosophical standpoint, that goes back to the creation. But even if you don't come from my faith standpoint, it doesn't take a lot of creativity to realize how important relationships are. If you put someone in isolation, they absolutely go insane. But I think what we found during COVID, and I'm curious on both of your opinions, is that fear of social isolation was so extreme during COVID. And I think one of the reasons why people were so darn afraid to say anything is they're afraid that they were going to be totally ostracized within their communities, whether it was their church, whether it was their job, whether they'd lose their job. They didn't want to be completely outcast and seen as a crazy kook. And even though many of the people knew the truth, they chose, sort of like Solzhenitsyn, they chose to live the lies. They chose to live by lies. And so do you think there was a fear of social ostracization that was driving this? And I have a few other theories as well, but what are your thoughts on that?
Jay?
Yeah, I think that played an enormous role, certainly among academics. I think what Don described among economists, it wasn't just that we stayed silent, that we actively made up crazy justifications for the lockdowns, or to not count the cost of the lockdowns, right? So there was a paper done by two well-known economists arguing that the lockdowns would impose zero marginal costs because the people would
How can you state
automatically
that?
lock themselves away already just based on fear. I mean, so the idea is that the formal lockdown has no effect because people lock themselves away, as if like everyone has the economic capacity to stay home, and Howard Hughes likes stay home and stay safe. Um, but even more to the point, what you just said about social isolation is, like, I think, is so critically important to understand why the lockdowns were such a great evil. Again, we can. I mean, Genesis 3. You have, like, it's not very long after Adam's created where the line comes out from God. It's like, it's not good for man to be alone, right? So that
Right.
there's like, certainly, but that leave aside the theological idea, the psychological idea is completely accurate. We are built for community, right? We are built to be in community with each other. And severing that kind of community is going to lead to tremendous harm. So, like, you saw by June 2020, the CDC did a survey of the United States and found that 1 in 4 young adults had seriously considered suicide the previous month. June 2020. The
That's terrifying.
depression, the anxiety, it was so directly connected to the lockdowns. The huge uptake in drug overdoses. All that is just, it's a symptom of the fact that we are meant to be we support each other, our psychological health, our actual health, by being in community with each other. We replace the idea of that with the idea that we are all biohazards, at the encouragement of
I
public
know.
health, right? That we're supposed to treat each other as if we're just biohazards and nothing else. It was a violation of sort of basic. I mean, I think, like, every single field failed in this, right? So if you mentioned how Christian churches behaved. We mentioned economists, epidemiologists. We all decided together that we were going to throw away our expertise and become in service of the idea that we have to treat each other as biohazards, and it's enforced by this group conformity. Like, so why did we get this crazy excommunication happening to my friend Scott Atlas, who's a doctor and economist here at Stanford? He goes and tells Trump basic sensible things: protect older people, open schools. But Stanford, the faculty senate, excommunicated him. They used the word anathema. It's a religious word
Wow.
in the denunciation of him. Um, it was I don't. Is moral panic the right word? I mean, it's like it's. I mean, I can kind of understand now how difficult it was to resist if you were living in the Soviet Union, for instance, and in service of this totalitarian power, right? You stick your neck out and you're going to get absolutely hammered. And it's not just the government; it's the entire community. All of the faith communities, the academic communities, all of the sort of institutional communities that would normally stand up for basic civil liberties, forget about any esoteric ideas. Just the idea that kids should be able to go to school. All of that gets thrown out in service of, we're all biohazards.
It's wild. I told someone one time that my daughter was really struggling because she was at a very formative age, one of my youngest children, and she's struggling because she can't see anyone's face. She can't read lips. She can't see facial expressions, and I was trying to tell this individual, one, you're violating this poor little girl's conscience because she doesn't want to live in this hellscape, and then secondarily, think about the back to the law of unintended consequences, which you've both touched on. Think about the rippling law of unintended consequences. And his response was, "Children are resilient." I was like, "Well, they're resilient, but at a certain point, there becomes major deficiencies in a child's education, a child's experience." I mean, I think as an adult, it was okay. Like, it was a horrible experience for me to go through COVID, but I think it was profoundly worse for many children. Talk about the effect, Don, talk a little bit about the effect of what this had on kids.
Well, I mean, I'm not a physician or a psychiatrist. My son was already in graduate school when COVID hit, so he wasn't a kid. Although I will say that my son's pretty independent minded, and he was in his first year of PhD studies at an Ivy League school, and I was surprised at how uh, much he conformed to the prevailing narrative at his
Mm.
school. And I think it's because, to be in that environment. The pro lockdown, we are biohazards to each other
It's wild.
attitude was so heavy that even my son, just sort of bought into it, because I don't think he even thought to contradict it. And I'm sure, I haven't talked to him about this, but I suspect that at the time he was reading some of the things I was writing and thinking that his father had gone nuts. I don't know that for sure, but I remember. I'll tell a story. I thought I was keeping my sanity through it all, but I remember going to give some talks in Destin, Florida, in March of 2021 for the Law and Economics Center. They had a week-long conference in Destin, and I got to Destin, and I think it was maybe the happiest week, certainly one of the happiest weeks of my life. It was only happy because very few people were wearing masks. You could go to a restaurant. It was normal. And just the feeling of living life normally that in that year, in that intervening year, had been taken away.
Yeah.
It was like liberation. I didn't want to leave Florida. I wanted to move to Florida. Quit my job at George
A lot of
Mason.
people did.
Well, yes, yeah. And I remember, like a lot of people, I don't like long waits at restaurants. One of my fellow lecturers and I went out to eat one evening at a restaurant in Destin, and the wait wound up being like 90 minutes. And normally I'd be furious. Oh, 90 minutes. I don't wait 3 hours.
Can I be maskless the whole time?
Yeah, and the waiters and waitresses actually approached, and I could see their faces. It was just I tell the story because I realized at the time, in that 1 year period in which life had changed so profoundly, I'd forgotten just how much we take for granted in this social interaction that we have. We have to see each other's faces. We have to be able to engage with each other professionally, commercially, on a neighborly basis, go to churches to see my students. I always felt that I was committing, it wasn't my fault because I didn't design it, almost committing professional malpractice by teaching online. And it's just, it was just a you called it a hellscape. I think that's a nice word for it.
I felt the same about teaching online, and I felt the same euphoria the first time I went to Florida. I mean, even just vicariously, I watched like there was an SEC football game where it was like fall of 2020, and they filled the stadium, and they're playing some some rock song, and everyone's jumping up and down. I've been watching a video from lockdown California, and I have tears in my eyes. I just felt
Yeah,
this chill of connection.
yeah.
I'll say one thing about your son and about young people generally, and this actually is again another indictment of economists and maybe psychologists. The techniques used to maintain compliance with the lockdowns and the orders were intentional behavioral economic psychological tools designed to make people want to comply. Right. And so one of the major tools that was used with young people was this language of, well, if you don't, you're going to kill grandma. Right. The idea is to use the empathy, the inherent goodness of young people, and use that essentially against their own interests. Right. So if you don't listen to me, you're going to kill grandma. Well, I mean, you're not going to get protests like happened during the Vietnam War, even though young people are being harmed at scale by these lockdowns, because for them, if they protest, their inherent goodness is at question.
Yeah, that's a good
Right?
point.
We essentially weaponize empathy against the interests of young people.
So you mentioned behavioral economists. I've been actually done quite a few episodes on behavioral economics on this podcast, and many of the behavioral economists really believe that we're irrational, right? That we have a series of cognitive heuristics and biases, and that we can't really act in our best interest, and we need nudgers per se, i.e., the government. Do you think that some of that? Who are you referencing when you say behavioral economists? I guess my question to you, Jay. And do you see some problematic sides to modern day behavioral economics?
I mean, I think that I'm not going to name specific names. I think the field as a whole has a major ethics problem that it hasn't yet grappled with.
Hmm.
I think if the ideas of the field are primarily used as a tool for propaganda by governments to gain compliance where otherwise people wouldn't get compliance, then behavioral economics as an academic discipline is no longer simply an innocent exploration into
Hmm.
the limits of human rationality. And I think during the pandemic, it was used in that way. Like in the UK, there's this thing called a nudge. The government had a thing called a nudge unit.
Hmm.
Being a major kind of idea. Like nudge sounds great. You just push people a little tiny bit. You change what the default is, and people choose the right thing, whatever you think the right thing is. But it wasn't that. It was like, how do I psychologically manipulate the population using these tricks that behavioral economists and psychologists have come up with? That's much more nefarious, and I think I think if behavioral economists are willing to embrace those kinds of techniques used for these kinds of purposes, I don't see any good reason for the public to support behavioral economics.
I agree. Can I say a word about behavioral economics?
Please do,
So
because
I
I have
agree. I
fun.
agree with everything that Jay says, 101%, if such a level is possible. Uh, but there's an interesting, uh, I think a further interesting thing can be said about it. So my had a colleague, he's retired now, Vernon Smith, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002. He won it, by the way, along with Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist whose work is instrumental in promoting
Same year.
behavioral economics. And Vernon, who is an extraordinarily good economist and very thoughtful and ethical man, Vernon's Nobel Prize lecture makes an interesting point that I think is relevant here. And I think it's a fair summary of part of it to say, yes, at an individual level, it's very easy to discover actions and sentiments that appear irrational. Right?
Sure.
That's almost child's play to do. What Vernon points out, and I think this is part of the larger history of good economics, is that we become rational. We because we were able to correct our errors and discover our errors. We
That's
become
right.
rational when we interact with each other
That's right.
economically and socially. So if you stick someone in a laboratory setting all alone without any social interaction, you can find
Yep.
all sorts of irrationalities.
Yes, you can.
And if you leap from that to, oh my gosh, therefore, if we let all these irrational people out in society, we're going to have this totally irrational outcome. That misses the point of what economics contributes. And what
Right.
economics contributes is the understanding that when you have all these irrational people, irrational at the individual level, perhaps, let's use that term, when they get together in social settings and market settings, that irrationality largely goes away because you have these corrective mechanisms and you get feedback that prompt you to know how what you're doing is not quite right, and it gives you incentives to correct what you're doing. So I forget off the top of my head, I forget exactly Vernon's term, but I think he called it ecological rationality. We may be
Yep.
we may have a lot of individual irrationality. By the way, I don't think we're as individually irrational as a lot of the behavioral
I
economists
agree
are.
too.
But of course, we're not homo economists who are lightning fast calculators of pleasure and pain like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Of course, we're not like that. Uh, but even if we are, as individuals, highly prone to irrational behavior, when you put us together in social situations and in markets, the outcomes tend to be very rational. We don't need nudgers uh, to to nudge us to what to do. We can normally figure out you look at history and you look at the history, call it nudging, call it whatever you like. My sense is that the history of that kind of intervention is not very pretty. And the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates, these only further I think, support
They
this
were they were shoved.
dangerous.
They were not nudges, Don. They
That's
were
right. They were nudges in the
They
sense
were shoved.
that an armed robber nudges the nozzle of his gun against your head and says your money or your life.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, look, what you brought up is really important, Don, because that feedback is what causes us as people to make better decisions. When we make a
That's right.
mistake, we get feedback and we change our minds, we change our ways. During the pandemic, what happened was that you had a relatively small group of people. You can call them, I call them the science TM, to trade like the capital T, capital S. They decided that they were so rational they could order all of society around their principle, the main principle being that we are all biohazards. And there was no feedback. They censored anyone that criticized them. Set up systems so that there was no chance of effectively correcting them. Even if you're from Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, George Mason, whatever, it doesn't matter what your credentials are. If you disagree with them, you're automatically in the outside. And so there's this hubris of, okay, we are not subject to the normal human tendency to not make rational choices. We are not we are hyper rational with incredible amounts of knowledge that can organize society along our vision, and that everyone must comply or else. And it's that lack of feedback, that censorship, then, that allows that policy to continue, that allows that irrationality at the center to continue. I think that was incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it too, if we believe inherently the way, say, that the Thaylors and the Kahnemans believe that we are inherently irrational, wouldn't the nudgers, the government planners, I mean, wouldn't that be a damning indictment of, say, central planning overall? I've always, what I've always said about behavioral economics in its modern iteration, is who nudges the nudgers? Right. So who is there to hold the nudgers in check? Because if we're all subject to these heuristics of irrationality, and the other thing too is it all gets decontextualized. I mean, a lot of the literature, they're very, I think you said this, Don, it's like very controlled environments where they're experimenting on people and they're probably getting an outcome that they're looking for. But when you contextualize, like I actually had Gerd Gigerenzer on this podcast a few weeks ago, and one of the things that we talked about is when you actually add context to situations, some of these what appear to be mental breakdowns or heuristics or irrationalities, when you add context, aren't irrational anymore. Like, for instance, if you take a salesperson and if they're prone to, say, the overconfidence bias, well, there's a premium for having a level of moxie and overconfidence if you're in a sales relationship, right? So in certain contexts, there might be a reward for being more confident, right? And the idea, too, that every single actor has the same series of irrationalities just isn't true. I know a lot of folks that don't have overconfidence. I know a lot of people that don't have confirmation bias. And to your point, it's because of experience over time. The other thing I've been thinking about, just as you two were talking, was I thought of Hayek a lot during the pandemic. I mean, when you talk about all these social interactions, it just makes me think of Hayek's spontaneous order, which don't you think irons out, even if we act in poor judgment at times, doesn't the spontaneous order of social engagement and interaction refine us as human beings? And then, I mean, if we're so irrational, how have we been able to organize a super dynamic, complex global macro economy if we're all making bad decisions all the time?
My blog is named Cafe Hayek, and there's no one who's had as large an intellectual influence on me as F.A. Hayek. But
I'm throwing you a bone here.
David Hume, Adam Smith, all of these great scholars, great social scientists, recognize that human beings are social animals. We get feedback. And I think the scholars, certainly who I admire most, from Adam Smith through F.A. Hayek, Vernon Smith, my Nobel Prize winning emeritus colleague, one of the features that they all share is a humility about what the individual human mind can know, and hence a skepticism about giving too much power to any one individual to use his or her knowledge as a means of compelling other people to do things. I think a lot of these people I think a lot of the people in the COVID episode were not so well intentioned. They were just exercising power because they like to exercise power. I don't doubt that
Mm-hmm.
a lot of others though were well intentioned, but that doesn't give you an excuse to override the wishes of other people. It doesn't give you an excuse to suppose that the knowledge that you think you have is somehow so well settled that you can ignore feedback, that you can ignore dissent. In fact, that you can suppress dissent, which, of course, Jay was a victim of this intent to suppress dissent. I don't think it's too much of a simplification, at least as a first order cut at things, to say, you divide the world here into two people. You have people who recognize the limitations of both the human mind and the human character. Right? We're flawed
Mm-hmm.
creatures, both in character and in intelligence and in our ability to know. And you have the other group of people who think that we're somehow like, if only we try hard enough, we could like grasp the mind of God. And and then if you have a PhD, particularly from an elite institution, and you grasp the mind of God, and if it is, heck, if it's the mind of God, why should we let these peons
Yeah.
dissent from it? I mean, this is the mind of God speaking, and the best thinkers, the best I think both intellectually and ethically, the best thinkers never forget that even the most intelligent, well-informed, and well-meaning person is a flawed human creature. And that flawed human creature should never be set at loose to be able to impose his or her will unilaterally on others.
As you're talking, it makes me think of Thomas Sowell's conflict of visions, because really what you're
Yeah,
laying out
yeah,
is
yeah.
there's
The
two
unconstrained
visions, right?
vision, yeah.
Yeah, so we believe, I think the three of us would believe in a constrained vision of humanity, and I think the ruling apparatus within the halls of both academia, corporate America, and then obviously government, I should say the three. These are people that have a very unconstrained sort of Rousseauian view on the world, and we experience that. Let's talk about I'm going to switch gears and get back
Yeah.
more into
Can I just say
COVID again.
one thing about Soul real
Yes.
quickly? So
Yeah, yeah.
I haven't had many quotations that I've ever posted on my office door. One that I've had for many years was the final sentence from Sowell's 1980 book, Knowledge and Decisions. And I might get this off by a word or two, but that his final sentence in that great book is, freedom is the right of ordinary individuals to find elbow room for themselves and a refuge from the rampaging presumptions of their betters. It's a wonderful. And so we got too many rampaging presumptions.
It's so true. I think Dr. Henderson made us read that book, by the way, in his class. So
Yeah,
great.
great.
It's
I love that book.
phenomenal read. So Jay, so we've talked a lot about the government, the craziness of the lockdowns. They particularly went after your reputation. You said you were you received a lot of death threats and just vicious behavior, but also just an attempt to ruin your career. I mean, you're this fringe epidemiologist who has an MD and also a PhD in economics. You're at Stanford and you're partnering with other. Let me just list off these other ridiculous institutions like Harvard and Oxford, for instance. And you create this Great Barrington Declaration, and then you're the direct target of people like Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci. Talk a little bit about what it was like to be, a direct target of the government for speaking against what they determined to be, I will say, ex cathedra.
Yeah, so that was so we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, Martin Kulldorff, Sunetra Gupta, and I, in October 4th, 2020. I discovered a few months later that it took Francis Collins 4 days to react to it. His reaction was an email to Tony Fauci, uh, calling the three of us that wrote it, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard and Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, and me, fringe epidemiologists, just as you said, an ad hominem attack, right? Not actually an analysis of what we said was right or wrong, and then calling for a devastating takedown of the premise of the declaration. And that took the form of media hit pieces, one after the other, absolutely uh, with like ridiculous slurs about us wanting to let the virus rip. The declaration called for focused protection of vulnerable people. The premise, I mean, if you're going to make an argument on their behalf, what they effectively were saying is that without lockdowns, you can't protect older people, you can't protect vulnerable people. That turned out to be wrong. It was wrong in the spring. You could already see that that was wrong in the spring. 40% of the deaths were people in nursing homes. All right, because we didn't have the idea of focused protection, Andrew Cuomo sends COVID-infected patients to nursing homes. If focused protection had been the central kind of strategic idea of our policy, we'd never have done that. I mean, of course not. Why would you send COVID-infected patients to the most places where the most vulnerable are?
It's wild.
So the premise of their argument, if I'm going to steelman their argument, is that lockdowns are necessary to protect the vulnerable was already proven wrong, and it got proven wrong over and over and over again. Instead, it was just a lie. It was like, we want to let the virus rip, therefore we're evil eugenicists that we should just ignore. The reason they did that, Drew, is that they wanted that really a lot of the lockdown kind of support for and unfortunately I have to say, like, the public supported lockdowns. Like, they supported it certainly in March of 2020. Even within, I think, September, if you took a public poll, you'd see a support for lockdowns. But a lot of the reason why they supported it was this illusion that there was a scientific consensus in favor of them. Right there, actually, it's very connected to what you guys was just talking about this, like, sort of engineering vision of society. I actually drew back to what you said about at the very beginning of the podcast of like the Imperial College model of this model of where people just, it's a very naive model of how society actually works. It's literally a model where people randomly interact with some probability, and if they're scared or if there's a lockdown, they don't interact, and so there's less chance of passing a disease on. Right?
And that's just absurd on its face.
It's just a stupid little mechanical model of how society works, which has no relation to actual society actually works, right? In the way societies actually work, there's no way a lockdown could possibly work. So they have this, like, mechanical vision of, like, how society works, but the thing is, they've created successfully an illusion that every scientist agrees with them. And so when you get Martin, me, and Sunetra, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. I mean, I've always hated this sort of, like, I don't really care that Stanford has a good reputation. It doesn't matter to me. Like, if my ideas are right, my ideas are right. It doesn't matter if I come from Stanford or I come from, the middle of nowhere. But I figured this was the one time in my life I was going to use it. Like, we got Stanford, Harvard, Oxford saying, look, this lockdown idea doesn't have a consensus. There are legitimate scientists that disagree with them. Mm-hmm. The government scientists, like Francis Collins, like Tony Fauci, they viewed us as a threat because we shattered the public idea that there was a consensus in favor of their policy, right? So even though the document itself was the same pandemic management plan that we've used for a century, they had to say to the public, it's so far outside the bounds that you should ignore these scientists. Nobel Prize winner that Mike Levitt signs on, doesn't matter. He's too far outside. Don Boudreaux signs on. No, it doesn't matter. He's too far outside. What matters is all these other fringe scientists are crazy people. You only need to listen to us, Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, and you can just see it in how Tony Fauci reacted to criticism. Right, at one point he's talking to some guy on CNN, and he's like, and his view is, like, he says, if you criticize me, you're not simply criticizing a man. You're criticizing science itself. Everyone knows I represent science. It's as if you were like Louis XIV or something. He's like, la science c'est moi. I mean, it is an absolutely insane kind of vision where one individual has the knowledge to structure every interaction in society.
It was pretty Orwellian. It felt very Big Brother-ish, right? We're always at war with, Eurasia or East Asia or whatever it is. I know you can't get into the psychology of who these men were or are. Collins is a professed, religious person as well, similar to us. What do you think was motivating these men? You have any idea? Because it just seemed like the evidence was so extremely obvious. But what was motivating these men?
I have a theory, and I don't think it's the normal theory. I mean, so for instance, I've heard people say it's just simply power, or it's just simply like money or something like that. I think, like, people like Francis Collins and Tony Fauci, what motivates them is immortality, right? The immortality that comes from like significant scientific discovery and advancement, right? So Tony Fauci, I think, would love to be remembered as the next Jonas Salk, or a new Jonas Salk, a man who solved the deadly plague by science, right? It was going to be HIV for him, but he never got the vaccine that he wanted. And I read a paper of his where he lays out a vision for how society ought to be structured to avoid pandemics. It's a to me a dystopian vision. I'm sure for him it's a utopian vision where we structure everything about our lives to reduce the likelihood of passing disease on to each other. And this is before the pandemic. He wrote this sort of utopian vision. He wants to be remembered as somebody who cured the world of all disease.
Do you think that's why he was so willing to engage in what I would say is pretty dangerous gain of function research?
That's
I want to talk about
explicitly
that as well. Is that
That's
why he was doing it?
explicitly. And it's not even just gain of function. It's the whole research enterprise is let's go out into the wild places, go find pathogens that might make the leap. The bat caves of China, anywhere. Bring them into labs, figure out which ones are likely to make the jump using sophisticated molecular biological tools, including gain of function work potentially, and then develop countermeasures for those pathogens that are most likely to make the jump, so that if they make the jump to humans, we're already ready for it.
Do you
In
think
a,
they were terrified? Well, I'm sorry. Finish your thought, Jay, and then I'm going to ask you a follow up.
Oh yeah, so Drew, I think the thing is like this pandemic, they could point to this as a success story, right? They were working on this pathogen, this or something very very closely related to this pathogen before the pandemic started. And how did they get a vaccine within days of the sequence of the virus coming out? It's because they already had countermeasures in mind for very similar pathogens.
Do you think this did leak from? Was it a lab leak from? Do you think it's possible that, as radical as this may sound, I can't believe we're still talking in these terms. But do you think it's possible that our government was behind the gain of function research that led to COVID-19? Do you think that is a possibility? And do you think there's pretty strong evidence, because even Collins admitted this under oath, probably because he didn't want to fully perjure himself. But is it possible that this virus did indeed leak from a lab in Wuhan?
I think there's almost certainly leaked from a lab in Wuhan. There is certainly the case that the United States and Chinese governments both sponsored this research. This is a Chinese American Chernobyl.
It's chilling. It's chilling. Do you think Fauci perjured himself when he was putting himself in pretzels with? I'm curious from both of your opinions. When he was with Rand Paul in Congress, and he kept saying he's like getting angry and wagging his finger. Do you think it's when he was trying to get Orwellian with the words and recraft what the words were in terms of, well, this is not gain of function, but then he described gain of function. Do you think that was a moment of perjuring himself?
Yes.
You're a lawyer, Don. What do you think?
So if perjury requires conscious intent, intent, I think Jay's probably correct. I think yes. On the other hand, I can imagine, if we got into his head, he's so convinced that his work is so important and indispensable for humanity that there was justification for him to do what he did and to say what he said. The kind of God complex that people get and certainly Fauci had every reason to have that God complex in 2020 and 2021. The press were treating him as if he were the font of all medical wisdom.
I did take my son to Dick's Sporting Goods to get some baseball stuff. I think we were getting baseball gloves. I remember being in the store and a woman walks by with a face mask that said, "I," with a big heart, Anthony Fauci. I thought, what world do we live in where we will turn these people into demigods? I almost said something to the lady. I'm like, this is spooky, woman. Like, what are you doing? But that's the world we live in now. I mean, I think he treats himself like a god, and I think people treated him like a god.
Yeah, and if you get treated like a god, at some point you come to believe you are.
Mm.
I mean, I think that okay. So let me try to make a defense of Tony Fauci's what I believe was a perjury. I mean, this research program isn't just Tony Fauci, right? This research
That's
program
fair.
to prevent pandemics, it has its roots in, I mean, at the very least, in is it like the early the Bush administration after in the war on terror.
Hmm.
It developed out of that bioterror incident that happened with anthrax. There was a whole infrastructure that builds up to try to prevent and prepare for bioterror events. It leaps into this like dual use kind of thing where like maybe we can not just prevent bioterror events but also prevent uh, natural pandemics as well. That whole structure builds up, and it's not just Tony Fauci that's responsible for that. Um, and so there's some element of like, national security at stake. I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly. I don't have a classified clearance. I don't know exactly what was going on with that. But in terms of like when Rand Paul asked Tony Fauci, did the NIH support gain of function work? The answer to that question, the only answer to that question possible is yes.
Mm.
The only truthful answer to that question is yes.
He just couldn't admit that to the public because that would have brought everything down.
Well, I think the reputation of the NIH is at stake. The NIH has long enjoyed pretty solid approval by the American people as a way for us to stay for the United States to stay at the forefront of science, to develop cures and treatments for diseases, and it has a long, great track record. There's a good reason for that solid success. But I think that the reputation of the NIH is at stake here. If the NIH is partly responsible for this pandemic, for the research that led to this pandemic, the American people are going to look at this whole enterprise very skeptically going forward. And so a tremendous number of scientists, their lives and their livelihoods depend on, and their work depends on getting funding from the NIH. And so what you're seeing is, I think, a populist struggle, and if the populace understands that the NIH sponsored dangerous research, whether gain of function or not, that actually led to this pandemic, or at least in part contributed to this to the causing of this pandemic, the public's going to start questioning whether we should be supporting science like we have at all, or at the very least, there needs to be much more public oversight of science so that we don't conduct dangerous research.
I mean, one of the questions I have on my list, which is towards the end, I'll ask it now, is I've always been somewhat skeptical of the idea of the government being the primary funder of scientific endeavors, just because I don't think the government is always objective. It's always been sort of pitched that, well, if there's private research, there's going to be too many biases involved, so therefore let's go to somehow a group of people that are magically unbiased and let them dole out all the cash. I've also wondered, is there a fundamental problem with the reality that the state, which has their own interests, is the primary source of scientific research and funding? And I have a lot of friends that are in the sciences as academics, and I interviewed a gentleman, Roger Pelkey Jr., regarding climate change, and basically he's a left of center guy, and he went slightly against the narrative that the Obama administration was pushing regarding climate change. And he believes in climate change, and he even thinks it's problematic. He just thought that they were dramatizing and using flawed climate models. And the moment he went against it, funding starts drying up. He starts getting subpoenaed by Congress. He has to go before Congress. Smear ads are being run against him that he's being paid by big oil. And so he's had to essentially find his own funding. And so he's using his own, Substack. He's got his own Substack page, and now he can basically self-fund. So I guess talking to people like him, like Roger, and talking to other scientists and other people in academia, I really am troubled by the fact that the government controls the purse strings. Do you all see a fundamental problem? And is there any other alternative that we could pursue where we could get funding as opposed to just from the biased government?
So I'm speaking for myself. I'm not sure exactly how Jay thinks about this. The classic economic theory is that when you have sort of general knowledge that the benefits of which can't be captured by the people who produce it, then too little of that knowledge is generated. It's a positive externality in the language of economics, and we don't get enough of it. And so it's a lovely theory in the textbook. What the textbook, though, doesn't point out, and I think as COVID makes clear, is that so the textbook solution is, okay, we're going to have government do it. The government's going to use taxpayer money, and you said magically unbiased, Drew. The government officials will then channel these funds to do this general research so that society gets the benefits and we don't have to rely upon private individuals to do it. But I don't believe you can have government officials who are not biased in their own way.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy in sort of the classic small t sense of the word. It may be that if we rely exclusively on the private sector, we get too little general research. It may be if we then turn it over to the public sector, we get too much or too biased such research. I don't know a way around the problem. There is no such thing as making an individual not subject to some interest that's going to bias his or her decisions when choosing how to allocate those funds. And it's not at all clear to me that the biases that would arise in a purely market setting are worse than the biases that arise when government is involved. It could be otherwise, but it's not at all evident to me that that's the case.
Yeah, that's how I feel. Jay, do you have any thoughts?
I was going to say, like Don, you said exactly what I mean. There's this Pigouvian justification you can make for why the public, why there should be public funding of science. To some extent, I agree with that Pigouvian justification. I also agree, also, Don, that there's no way for any science to be funded without some biases entering, private or public, right? That you're going to get this, right? So people will get the science that they won't pay for or want. I think so we're always in an imperfect world. The question is, like, how do we adjust for those biases? How do we make decisions based on knowing that those biases exist? I think that, like, to me, the key thing is decentralization. Like, if you're going to have scientific funding by a single government agency with a single person on top with a single scientific view, you're going to get catastrophically bad decisions potentially being made. You have to allow there to be some sort of decentralization, some check on that kind of power. And that's what we lacked during the pandemic. I mean, I don't want to weigh in on is the NIH too big or too small, but I will say it's too powerful. Like, it needs to have many more checks on its power, especially of the people at the very top. They abuse their power, right? You had the head of the NIH trying to destroy the reputations of scientists that disagreed with him simply because they disagreed with him. That is a massive abuse of power on the part of the top of the NIH. And the NIH still hasn't acknowledged it. Like, it's as if they don't even. It's just normal course of behavior. My sense is that we aren't the only scientists they've ever done that to. Like, they normally quietly demolish the careers of scientists that they don't of views that they don't like. Usually by just funneling money away from those kinds of people. If we're going to have publicly funded science, we need it to be decentralized with many more checks and balances and a lot of more public oversight than we've had.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Collins and Fauci for just a moment, and then I'm going to switch gears. Did they ever reach out to you?
No.
In any way?
A number of people of mine, friends of mine, I'm like 1 degree removed from Francis Collins. We have several common friends, and my common friends have reached out to him, and what he's told them, in effect, is that because I'm involved in this lawsuit, this First Amendment lawsuit against the Biden administration, he says that the government lawyers don't want him to talk to me. And I think that's just a terrible excuse. I mean, there's no good reason for him. He didn't reach out to me before, but when he wrote that email to Tony Fauci, if I were sitting in his position as the head of the NIH and I had these troublesome scientists that disagreed with me, I would have organized a panel discussion with them.
Yeah,
I would have said, okay, let's have it out. Let's figure out why we disagree with each other substantively instead of trying to destroy them. But no, the answer is no. Neither he nor Tony Fauci have reached out to me.
I mean, I just think it's remarkable. I'm going to ask you a slightly maybe touchy question, and you can choose not to answer it. But he is a huge, he's a pretty vocal person as a professed Christian. Does it bother you as a fellow Christian that he would have treated you so poorly, that there's no apology? How do you handle that?
I mean, I admired him before the pandemic for his scientific work, certainly on the Human Genome Project, and I absolutely, Drew. I read his book on his faith and how it's consistent with his scientific view. I mean, I could quibble with it, but like the sentiment of it, I can entirely admire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for someone like him to say he's a professed Christian in the biological sciences actually takes some courage. Like
It does.
there's not a lot of professed Christians, and there's often some open hostility to Christianity within the biological sciences, because the perceived idea that Christians are opposed to the ideas of evolution, for instance, right? So for him to stick his neck out, I think is quite an admirable thing. And
Agreed.
I viewed him with a lot of. I mean, I admired him before the pandemic. I think the way that he's acted during the pandemic, it's just a huge disappointment. I mean, Christians, it's not like I have this naive view of Christianity where once you become a Christian, therefore you're a perfect human being, right? So
Right.
that's just not
It's
obviously not
false.
true. Um, but he's acted in ways that really have disappointed me,
Hmm.
and I think that I hope someday that he feels convicted over it and then tries to make amends.
Well, if you're out there, Francis Collins, you want to come on my podcast
Yes.
to talk about it, let me know. I have a feeling that he's not going to take me up on that. Um,
He's under lawyers' orders not to, apparently.
I guess so. I guess so. It's disappointing because I've had a similar admiration, and it's a bummer. That's all I can say. It's a bummer. Let's talk about the lockdown. So I'm sort of switching gears here. Let's talk about all the unintended consequences. Right, that phrase has come up multiple times in this discussion, and I think one of the breakdowns during COVID is that we're so hyper specialized in today's world. I'm going to throw a little theory at you, and I'm probably not the first person to think of this. I'm probably the thousandth person to think of this, but I think of the Laffer curve, and if you're say at the front end, it's a bell-shaped curve, and if you're at the front end, if there's no taxation, there's no revenues. And if you think of it in the extreme, if we were to raise taxes, say 100%, there might be a few people willing to work, but you ultimately you disincentivize labor at a certain extreme. So therefore, we can conceptualize. Well, Dr. Henderson had a really compelling, interesting, sort of nuanced position on this. But the general Laffer curve is a bell-shaped curve. Is there a bell-shaped curve too with specialization? So I think we all love Adam Smith. We appreciate specialization. Obviously we are vastly more productive, but is there a point at which, and maybe it doesn't apply necessarily to the production of widgets or pins or other things, but is there a point at which specialization really clouds people's judgment because they're so focused in on their particular discipline that they're unable, like, for instance, we've talked today that some individuals have no training in the social sciences. So all three of us, I have much less amount of formal training, but all three of us have formal social science training in economics, which inherently allows us, or we've been trained to at least think through the law of unintended consequences. But a lot of scientists, it seems, and I'm painting with some broad strokes, so bear with me. It seems that some scientists are so hyper specialized. Do you think some of the scientific community was a hammer in search of a nail, and they couldn't think through the law of unintended consequences, and thus the lockdown measures just seem so rational because they were, and is there, back to the bell-shaped curve, is there a point at which we need the Renaissance man? Because both of you on this podcast, I mean, Don, you've got a JD and a PhD, and as you mentioned, Jay, you've got an MD and a PhD. You're Renaissance men here. You've got an interdisciplinary approach. I find it interesting that a lot of the people that have more of a broader perspective are the ones that ultimately arrived at truth, and some of the people within the specialized camps kind of got clouded. I know that was a really long explanation, but any thoughts on specialization? And then also, do you think that really affected the desire to then let's just lock it down because this is what my research is showing me?
That's a very rich question, and I'm more interested in hearing what Jay has to say than what I'll say. But let me just briefly say, look, one of the things that economics teaches is that nothing is free. There are always trade-offs. And so specialization, as wonderful as it comes with a cost.
That's
Hayek,
right.
we mentioned Hayek earlier. Hayek has a wonderful paper called The Dilemma of Specialization. And as we become more focused, we become much better at doing what we know, which is a good thing. But then, of course, we have less and less knowledge of and conception of and ability to see the connections that exist in other aspects of the world. But they're vast and they're huge. And so yeah, there's a trade-off with specialization. I wouldn't say we've gone too far. I mean, I think that specialization is an incredibly wonderful thing, but and I'm not sure it's a result of specialization per se or some other factor.
Sure.
But if your charge is to, um, if you are formally in charge of suppressing a disease, then you can be the world's greatest Renaissance man, but your charge is to suppress the disease. And so you tend to overemphasize the benefits that
Hmm.
come from disease suppression and
Hmm.
to minimize the costs of disease suppression. Because what my title is official disease suppressor. And so, and so
That's your incentive.
I don't much care about what's happening to the children and their ability to learn. I don't much care about what's happening to the ability of people to earn monetary incomes. I'm suppressing the disease, and so that's a worse problem. And having officials in charge of one particular outcome, I'm not sure it can be avoided altogether, but I think my guess is, and Jay, correct me if you think, I think Anthony Fauci thought of himself as the official disease suppressor.
Hmm.
And I understand if I thought of myself as the official disease suppressor, and I'm now worldwide, I am the face of official disease suppression in the world's most powerful country. Uh, it would take superhuman effort for me to weigh the results of disease suppression against the costs of disease suppression. I'm almost naturally going to attach far too much weight to an additional increment of disease suppression and too little weight to the costs. So it's like so many things in the world. There's no easy answer to how to avoid something like that.
What do you think, Jay, in the sciences? Is there a point at which people are too specialized?
You cited Adam Smith. That one major idea in his Wealth of Nations is that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, right? The division of labor. So you can get more specialization if you have well-developed markets where, and essentially the idea is that if there's communication between the people that are specialized, then you have a socially desirable outcome. You like a very efficient production with very little waste. And I think that idea kind of generalizes here as well. Like I think there's no problem really with specialization in scientific fields if there's really communication across the fields in effective ways. So just let's bring it to the pandemic. Tony Fauci is whatever he is, like let's say he's an immunologist. He's not really a public health guy. He doesn't really know very much epidemiology. He knows a lot of epidemiology. He's great scientific. He's a great scientific bureaucrat, very talented at garnering power within the scientific bureaucracy. Those are his skills. He doesn't know that the lockdowns are going to sever relationships such that like the poorest countries of the world, their labor markets are going to get utterly demolished, and the very poorest are going to starve. Right? That's not something. He's not a development economist, right? He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that there's going to be long-term learning loss, so that a generation of poor kids are not going to get the kind of education they deserve, and we're going to drive inequality into the next generation in ways that were previously unimaginable. Right? He doesn't understand the psychiatry or psychology of what extended isolation does to people. That's not his field, right? If you have again drawing the analogy out of Smith, you have a good market. The people that have this expertise feed into this decision making. So it's not just Tony Fauci with his narrow disease avoidance kind of approach. that reigns. What happens is he says, "I want to avoid disease," and then the psychologist comes in and says, "Look, this is what's going to happen to depression and anxiety." The educator comes and says, "Here's what's going to happen to kids." The economist comes in, the development economist comes in and says, "Look, the poor people are going to starve if you do this," right? And then now you have a rich discussion. So it's not specialization per se, it's the lack
Sure.
of communication and the effective counterbalance to this very monomaniacal focus on prevention of a single infectious disease. Even within medicine, that shouldn't have happened, right? And so I think the key thing to me is that, how do we set up a system so that it never happens again? How do we avoid putting so much power into the hands of a very narrow group of people who have a very narrow view of what good societies function like?
So a couple things, and I want to get back to how do we prevent this from happening again, because that's definitely on my list of questions today. Let's talk about the unintended consequences of the lockdown specifically. Have either of you read any research, or have you done your own research? And I remember at the very beginning, I looked at a friend and I said, "Mark my words, more people will die from the lockdowns from this darn virus. I guarantee it." It seems that there's a bit of research that confirms that. Do you know of any formal research that there have been significantly more deaths? I mean, I kept thinking, by the way, sorry to ramble, but I just kept thinking at the very beginning, we live in wealthy America. I mean, I've got a pantry the size of most people's bedrooms, chock full of food. And I also am a part of the, as you put it, Don, the laptop class. I was able to sit at home and have food delivered to me. I'm able to just correspond with clients on Zoom. I mean, my elite lifestyle continued to just move right along, no problem. But when I think about the folks in poor countries, not going to work meant like your kids starved and
Yeah.
you starved to death. And there were cases where they were locking people down in horrifying fashion. I watched some videos in China. They were using screws to bolt people's front doors shut. I don't know if the American public fully appreciates the horror that occurred in some of these cities. And then in some of these poor countries, people actually didn't get access to food, and people didn't have access to education. So, is there any research on how many people died from just lack of access to food, et cetera, and the horrors of the lockdowns?
So I don't think there's a solid number, but I'll tell you, in April of 2020, the UN World Food Program estimated 130 million people would face dire food insecurity, which is their way of saying starving. 130
Wow.
million people. There was an estimate in March of 2021 that 230,000 children had already died of starvation in India from the lockdowns, the economic dislocation caused by the lockdowns. There's no question that we killed more people with these policies. There's a great review by Steve Henke and Lars Jonig in Henke's at Hopkins, of looking at the econometric literature on the efficacy of lockdowns, how many lives were saved, and it's very, 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 very few lives are saved, if any, by lockdowns. Because in order to save a life, you have to say someone's ultimately not going to get the disease, right? And it's just not. John and I wrote this great op-ed for the Wall Street Journal about zero COVID, how the folly of it, right?
Yep.
The idea that so at best the lockdown delays when a certain class of people get the disease, and that's it. And then there's a great review by a man named Kevin Bardosh, who's the research director of Collateral Global, an organization, a UK charity that helped found, that looked at the collateral harms of lockdowns, and what happened in the poor countries is a moral crime.
Mm-hmm.
We have
It is a crime.
just to give you one data point, in Uganda, after 2 years of lockdown, where millions and millions of children didn't have any school. Forget about Zoom school. They didn't have access to internet. They didn't have anything. They had zero school for 2 years. 4.5 million of those kids never came back, lost completely. And the UN did this report. A lot of those kids, they were kids sold into like the girls were sold into sexual slavery. The little boys were put into child labor. And the reason is because the parents face this choice: either we do that with our kids, or the kids and we starve. That is the straits that we put the poorest people on earth into when we put these lockdowns in place. And it was entirely predictable from the very earliest days of the lockdown.
Were you both thinking through that when they were locking down? I mean, Don, what were your thoughts in terms of just human suffering?
So, a couple of things. One I mentioned earlier. I mean, a good economist. I fancy myself good. I'm not great, but a competent economist.
You're pretty good, Don. You're pretty good.
A competent economist understands that what looks simple to an ordinary person is actually the result of an incredibly complex and intricate set of social interactions. You go to the supermarket, and it looks so simple. You got all the stuff on the shelves, and there's the milk and it looks so simple. But there's a huge amount of complexity and processes that take place beyond that. And you start locking people down, all those things go away. Now, as Jay alludes to, in a rich country, we can afford a lot of this. All right, so yeah, there's a shortage of milk at the supermarket. We'll survive. We got our pantries the size of someone's bedroom full of other kinds of food. Might have to eat more leftovers. But for poor people, it's a lot worse. It can be dire. In very poor countries, it can be deadly. There's an example that Jay just pointed out indicates. So that's one thing. You just recognize that these lockdowns are going to have an immediate negative impact on all the economic processes that we take for granted and make us all poor. A second thing, it's related, but it's more broad. Over the long run, the greatest public health, the greatest source of improved public health is economic growth. Economic growth. It for a variety of reasons. Not for the obvious reasons. It obviously gives us better access to better formal health care and pharmaceutical products and medical devices. But it improves our nutrition. It improves the living environments that we're in. It's amazing for public health. It's very difficult to measure how many lives are going to be lost, how much morbidity is going to increase because of the huge hit to economic growth that the lockdowns of the COVID era have imposed. I don't know that we'll be ever able to measure it with any kind of precision, but I am confident it's there. I am confident that there will be people who will die. There will be people who will live worse lives, even if they don't die, because of the diminution of economic growth that is a direct result of the over-response to COVID that occurred starting 4 years ago.
I read. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say, Drew. There's a colleague of mine here at Stanford named Rick Hanishek who did an estimate of how much the learning loss that children in the United States got as a result of the school closures. What consequences it'll have, because you diminish their human capital. And over a lifetime, that has huge consequences. Of course, certainly for their labor output and for their income, but also for their health and well-being. So he estimated that something like 30 trillion or 40 trillion dollars of loss over their lifetime. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine at University of Washington, who's the editor of JAMA Pediatrics, in June or July 2020, published a paper estimating that the lockdowns, just the spring school closures alone, in terms of because there's this great health economics literature that measures how extra schooling translates into better health through your entire life. Just the spring closures alone cost American kids 5.5 million life years in expectation. It's the most short-sighted economic policy I have ever seen in my life, and I hope to never see any the like. And yet, economists stayed silent for the most part. Not Don, of course, but many economists stayed silent. It's just I think as a profession we need to face that. How is it that at this most critical moment, where it's most important for as a profession to speak and say, look, there are costs to what you're doing, the profession as a whole stayed silent, and that in fact chair-led the lockdowns.
Yeah. It's embarrassing to me, and even worse, disappointing.
Well, let's touch on that for just a minute. So, Jay, I listened to your interview with Jordan Peterson. I'm a huge Jordan Peterson fan, and you had made a comment in that interview about sort of crossing the Rubicon. So clearly, and I'm glad we hashed out the specialization thing. I appreciate your responses. It clearly wasn't a result of specialization, and I think there's some nefarious parts of the government, but you at some point reached, I'm going to call it the Solzhenitsyn moment. You just decided you're not going to live by lies. I've read his pamphlet, Live Not by Lies, probably 5 times in the last, several years, just as a reminder of like, the mass hysteria whipped us all up, and it whipped a lot of academia up, and it whipped a lot of people in corporate America and elsewhere up, and we chose to live the lies. And by the way, the Bolsheviks, they were only 20% of Russian society. They're only 20%, but so many people, as Solzhenitsyn warned, so many people just chose not to speak the obvious, blatant truth about the situation. And because so many people remained silent, Russia turned into a horrifying country. But you didn't live the lie, Jay, and you didn't live the lie, Don. So I want to ask both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Jay. You said to Jordan Peterson, I'm going to cross the Rubicon. How did you get to a place where you had the courage where no one else was willing to do it, especially in economics, which is just so disappointing? How did you get there?
I mean, the first time I heard of lockdowns, I thought they were a travesty. I thought that it was a disaster, and I was like Don, just incredibly disappointed that my fellow economists didn't speak up. I did that study we talked about earlier in April of 2020, that measuring how many people had antibodies. That was met with like universal hostility by academics, including econometricians, including former co-authors of mine, the university met it with like there was a hit piece done on my wife by some very scurrilous journalist. There was
What
a
does your wife
attack
do,
on
Jay?
me. She's an oncologist. She's a radiation
Okay.
oncologist. Yeah, she's a
Okay.
doctor. She and then the university conducted what they called a fact finding, but it felt like an inquisition, right? Based on all these crazy hit pieces. I don't know. At some point, and I was reading all of these reports about what was happening to the poorest of the world. I'm from a poor. My mom grew up in a Calcutta slum, right? I'm not. I teach at a fancy university, but I don't come from a fancy. My dad grew up in poverty. He had 7 brothers and sisters that he had to take care of after his dad died when he was 18. I lived in a public housing. I just couldn't. At some point, I just had to decide, like, do I care more about that, or do I care more about my reputation as a academic? And once I decided that whatever happens to my reputation, I have to say what I see. That the anxiety and the pressure just sort of lifted off of me. I mean, it made it much easier to continue to speak despite all of the craziness. But I had to decide. I didn't care anymore. I don't care if I decided if I never publish another paper, if I never add a line to my CV, if I get fired, then so be it.
At least you saved your soul. I mean,
Yeah.
even if the worst had happened, you saved your soul along the way. And it's amazing to watch all the people sell their souls. Don, what was going through your mind, and how did you stay the course and not cave the way so many other people caved?
There wasn't a moment in my life where I thought, oh, I have to choose between caving or not. I love economics. I love economics from the moment I was first introduced to it as an 18-year-old. And the thing that I love about it, one of the things I love most about it, and I still get goosebumps if I think about it enough, is just how astonishing the global market processes are that bring us this prosperity that we take for granted, including long lives and keeping our teeth until we're in our 90s and all the stuff that we Americans take for granted. And I love teaching that stuff to my students. I love pondering it. And so when the lockdowns came, that struck me as an arrow directed, a flame-tipped arrow directed right at the heart
Of
of
what you
the
love.
very thing I love about modern society and what my understanding of economics teaches me and has always taught me and made me excited about modern society. And I couldn't see how that flaming arrow at the heart of this vast system of social cooperation couldn't have anything but major, horrible consequences. And so, it, for me, it didn't even involve courage. It just, it was
So
ridiculous.
obvious.
It was so obvious, and so you speak out against it. And I got to say, I mean, unlike Jay, who I greatly admire, I've never had any, there was no personal attacks on me. I got nasty emails from people I don't know. Who cares?
Right.
But I've never had any death threats. But again, there was never a point in my experience with COVID where I had to think, okay, I can hunker down and play along, and I it just I just spoke out from the beginning as soon as it was obvious to me that what was going on was an unprecedented, horrible obstruction of human cooperation that would not only make us materially less wealthy, but probably also make us less healthy as well. And
I kept thinking.
the
I kept
evidence.
thinking the whole time too. I'm sorry, Don. Finish your
I,
thought.
I think the evidence as it's coming out more and more, I think that the wisdom of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration
We're correct.
were yeah um, and yeah
Donna, can I just say when I mean, I'd known about you for a long time before. I used to read your blog
yeah.
before, but when I saw that you spoke out, it was tremendously. My spirit just lifted because I was so disappointed in economists. I didn't think that there were very many that had the courage to speak out. You say it wasn't the courage, but I know what that environment was like, Don, and it did require courage. Absolutely did.
Well, well, we were both early in speaking out against the horror, but it doesn't feel. People always say, you get these interviews with people, these remarkable people who jump into a river to they save a life, and they get interviewed, and they say, "Well, I'm not a hero," and I'm going to think to myself, "You are really a hero."
Yeah, actually, you are. Yeah.
No, no, no. But in this case, honest to goodness, I don't feel heroic about it. This is what economists do, right? We
Yeah.
understand how the economy works, and we understand what damages these economic processes. It's very clear. I mean, look, you can complain about minimum wages and some FDA regulation or some FTC regulation. This is far more than that. This is a categorical sledgehammer taken to the entire economy. And to not speak out against that was just unfathomable to me, as it was to David Henderson and a few other people early on. And to get back to something that a theme that has run through this entire conversation, it remains a mystery why it was not more, why many more economists didn't see it that way from the beginning.
What's the you know at this stage of the game? What's the general sense with where I guess broader academia and the government? Like, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Are we at a place where you are starting to feel vindicated, the both of you? And do you think more of the public sentiment is in the camp with the Great Barrington Declaration, or is there still a great deal of hostility? Like, what's the sort of the state of things as of right now in 2024?
I mean, I have to say, although the Great Barrington Declaration was tremendously met with controversy, intellectually, I had no doubt it was going to be right. I mean, because
We're gonna win.
not, as I said earlier, it was based on a century of experience on how to manage respiratory pandemics, and there was just there's just wisdom in that knowledge that basing it on that. It wasn't original to us. It was just how people have learned over the centuries to manage pandemics. And so I had no intellectual insecurity about it. I think at the time I thought we were within the academic community with a deep minority. In retrospect, I'm not so sure we were in a minority even within the academic community. I think a lot of the academic community was cowed by the Tony Fauci's of the world, and the public at large also was in a state of fear. And as time has moved on, as that fear is lifted, a lot of people are looking back and saying, "Well, what was that really needed? Was that really necessary?" So I think that the public opinion has changed pretty dramatically since 2020. Um, the problem is like the people that made those decisions, they still have the power. They're still quite powerful. They're giving themselves awards. They're patting themselves on the back, and they're putting in place mechanisms to institutionalize the lockdowns and the lockdown until we can get a vaccine as the response to pandemics. The structures that led to that, the concentrated power within science, are still there. Um, and so I think we are kind of at a precarious point. We either choose to have a liberal society devoted to plural aims with a economy that sort of represents people in all of their various ways, or we decide that we are going to live as a society focused on managing the inevitable next pandemic with tremendous government power to change, to demand and to command, as at the heart of how we organize society. And I don't know which direction we're going to go, but that I think is the next big fight. I do think that we now have a lot of public on our side, and that's definitely a big asset.
Don, go ahead.
Very, very quickly, of course, there's a certain satisfaction that comes from reading people who. I mean, I think Francis Collins has admitted some. I can't remember the details now, but he's come around a little bit to saying, well, maybe we overreacted a bit. There's some satisfaction in encountering those recognitions, but I must say I don't sense yet, and this is in line with what Jay is saying. I have no sense now that people have come around enough to the recognition of how much error has been, how much error was unleashed and acted upon 4 years ago, to give me confidence that if COVID 25 or COVID 27 comes, that we won't repeat the same mistakes. I hope I'm wrong, but the, the little bit of admission that we've seen about errors made in 2020 through 2022 are not of a nature that causes me to think, "Phew, okay, we won't go through this again."
Right, right. So we're kind of getting close to the end here. I know we're getting close to two. Uh, Jay, you've had some successes though on the legal front. Talk to us just a little bit about your legal fight, because that gives me some hope, right? I mean, I'm with you, Don. There's a part of me that is fearful that not enough people have come around to the truth of what happened. That the death rate was not 3.4, or it was, magnitudes lower, as you put it, Jay. In the end, I think more and more people are recognizing the horrible devastation of lockdowns, what it did to mental health, what it did to the poor. I mean, again, and I'm really going on a diatribe. I hope people hear that for the three of us, we love humanity. I mean, we don't want to kill grandma. Neither of you gentlemen wanted to kill grandma. Neither of you gentlemen didn't love your neighbor. It was precisely the opposite. Because you had an inherent love for humanity, you believed in humanity, you wanted to take the proper measures so that we didn't ruin people, so we didn't ruin their lives. That said, I fear that we could fall back into this, but there's been some hope. And Jay, back to you. You're having some success on the legal front. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm involved as a plaintiff in this lawsuit called the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit. It's basically brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office against the Biden administration. The allegation of the lawsuit was that the Biden administration systematically suppressed scientific and other discussion on social media using essentially threats to social media, direct channels of communication, backdoor database access, and then third parties like the Stanford Internet Observatory to tell social media companies who to censor and what ideas to censor. And they did it at scale with large-scale AI tools, changes in the terms of service forced by these organizations, essentially by government forcing the terms of service change to censor scientific discussion online. And that lawsuit has met with a lot of success, actually. What we found, we got to depose Tony Fauci for 8 hours. We found the people in the Surgeon General's office, the CDC, the NIH, the White House itself, the FBI. They systematically organized what lower courts called a ministry of truth, censoring what Americans could say or not say online, using mafia-like techniques, essentially threatening the social media companies that if they didn't comply with these orders to censor, they in effect the back idea is that if they didn't comply, that they would be regulated out of existence. That's essentially what we found. The lower courts then ordered the Biden administration to stop doing it as a preliminary injunction. Preliminary injunctions are extraordinary because we haven't even had the trial yet. The trial still has yet to come. But because we are so likely to win in the trial, they ordered the Biden administration to stop censoring because it violates the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court just heard the case on the preliminary injunction. Actually, I was at the Supreme Court hearing. I don't know. I don't know which way they're going to go. I went in thinking there's such an open and shut case. Of course, they're going to stop the censorship. But I hope we win in the Supreme Court, because if we don't, I think that the American Republic looks very different than the one we grew up in. The First Amendment is pretty vital. Of course, the health of our democracy, but also the health of science. If you have the government can claim the power to censor scientific discussion on social media the way it has during the pandemic, essentially claiming that there's an emergency exception to the First Amendment. Well, we don't really have a republic anymore. We have something else entirely.
Don, what is your thought on the state of? I mean, to me, this is just an assault to free speech. What is your thought on the First Amendment as it pertains to this
Absolutely, I'm pretty much a First Amendment absolutist. There is no exception in the Constitution for
Agreed.
An emergency. In the Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous "No shouting, fire in a theater." That the First Amendment was never meant to protect that kind of speech, but this is categorically different. The notion that there is capital S science with trademark behind it is anathema to the very. It's anathema. First of all, it's anathema to the true scientific mindset. It's also anathema to the American project. Jay mentioned decentralization, contestation, freedom to dissent from unpopular opinions and to express that dissent. These are part of what it means to be, certainly in America, it should be part of what it means to be a human being in a free society.
Yeah.
And the minute you start carving out exceptions, so, well, the government can, we're all in favor of free speech, except when the government says we shouldn't be, well, then you just neutered. Not neutered, you've killed it. There cannot be exceptions of that sort, because those exceptions will inevitably undermine the amendment.
The unintended consequences of the government's response to COVID had incredible ramifications. Just incredible.
Still unfolding.
I mean, in some ways, the state of the freedom of the nation is at stake, and I hope that doesn't sound hyperbolic, but that's how I feel.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, this has been an incredible discussion. I feel very honored and humbled to get both of you at the same time. Thanks for your time, and I hope to do it again sometime.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Don.
Yeah.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com. Or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.